The sound of something hitting the polished stone floor was sharp and dry, a choked groan. And then, in a study larger than his own apartment, Richard Hale, CEO of a multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical corporation, collapsed into his chair, his hand clutching his chest as if trying to tear it open. White light flooded in from the floor to ceiling glass, casting a pale gray pallor on his face, the face of a man who had just lost more than half his strength simply to breathe. His other hand, trembling, braced against the edge of the desk. A gold-plated fountain pen slipped from his fingers and fell to the floor. A few feet away, a woman in a blue uniform froze, her mop not yet touching the ground. Her eyes, deep and warm brown, widened, not with surprise, but with the recognition that what she had been trying to warn of for days was happening right before her. No one was here to listen to her. No one ever listened to her. In this building, with all its suits in $1,000 swivel chairs, she was just the shadow who walked past, head down, doing her job in silence. But that silence, today, was shattered. 3 weeks earlier, Cheryl had paused at the door of this very office and seen the same figure, tall, confident, one hand on the phone, the other signing papers, sway slightly, as if losing his balance. She had swallowed, stepped inside, and said in a voice that was soft but firm, "Mr. Hale, I think you should get your heart checked. Soon." He had looked up, his cold gray eyes flicking down to the name tag on her chest, then to the mop in her hand. The corner of his mouth had curled, not in a smile, but a cut of cold steel. "Mind your own business. We don't need amateur nurses here." The words amateur nurse echoed in Cheryl's mind for nights afterward. Not because they were wrong, but because she had once been more than just a nurse. She had been someone patients waited for, colleagues respected, doctors trusted. She had saved lives like his, until it was all taken away by a falsified report and handshakes behind closed doors. She had been silent. They had ignored her. But now, as Richard Hale sat there, his face pale, his eyes wide with a lack of oxygen, Cheryl knew that, if she did nothing, he wouldn't last another 10 minutes. The sound in the room seemed to be sucked away. Cheryl rushed forward, but not in the panicked way of a bystander. Her steps were measured, even, decisive. Her left hand gently rested on Richard's right shoulder to steady him, while her right hand skillfully pulled his swivel chair flush against the desk to support his back so he wouldn't slide down. The smell of polished wood and cold coffee wafted up, mixed with the faint metallic scent of the fallen pen, a smell only someone who had stood in an emergency room at 3 a.m. would remember. "Mr. Hale, look at me," she said, not loudly, but with a resonant quality that compelled one to listen. "I need you to breathe in through your nose, out through your mouth. Don't try to stand up." The door burst open. Richard's assistant Evan froze, his eyes darting from the ink stain on the floor to Cheryl's hand, steadying his boss's collar. He flinched as if he had just witnessed an overstepping of authority. "What are you doing in here? Don't touch him." Evan rushed forward, his hand already raised as if to push the blue shadow out of the office's luxurious frame. Cheryl looked up, her gaze so calm it made him slow down. "Call 911 now. Say possible cardiac emergency. Male, 56, chest pain radiating to the neck, cold sweat, rapid and irregular pulse. Give them the room number, and mention there's an AED in the hallway. Call now." The way she delivered each instruction made Evan pause. He didn't like being ordered around, especially not by someone who wasn't on the executive floor's white-collar payroll. But there was a resolve in Cheryl's eyes that 2-hour strategy meetings couldn't produce. Evan took a half-step back, pulled out his phone, his voice trying to maintain a professional tone despite his dry throat. Cheryl loosened Richard's tie and unbuttoned his top button. The skin beneath was pale, a flush on his right cheek more pronounced as he tried to lift his head. No need. I'm fine," Richard rasped, clinging to his habit of command, even as his lungs felt like they were being squeezed. "You're not fine." Cheryl replied, her eyes fixed on his chest, which was rising and falling too quickly. Look at me. Count with me. 1, 2, 3, breathe in. 4, 5, 6, breathe out. She placed 2 fingers on his radial artery. The pulse was fast, irregular. The signs connected in her mind with the reflexes of someone who had lived for years amidst the beeping of monitors and the squeak of shoes on vinyl floors. Outside, the click of heels on the stone floor, Sandra from operations her eyeliner as sharp as a paper cut. She glanced at the scene, recognized who was holding her boss, and her face immediately shifted to the cold calm of someone who had learned to put hierarchy before need. Evan, what's going on? The question was perfunctory. Her eyes weren't asking. Her eyes were saying, clean this up before anyone else sees. Evan whispered. The paramedics are on their way. It might be his heart. Cheryl kept the rhythm, her voice even. Mr. Hale, does the pain radiate down your left arm? Are you nauseous? Dizzy? He gave a very slight nod, his eyes watering as he fought for both breath and dignity. A faint tremor at the corner of his mouth was like a breeze on a still lake, tiny. But for those who knew, it was a bell tolling. You are violating safety protocols. Sandra cut in, standing an arm's length away, her voice not loud but slicing through the air. We have instructed service staff not to remain in rooms when executives are working. Your safety protocols don't save lives, Cheryl replied without turning her head. She tilted her head toward Evan. The AED is in the hallway, to the right of the photocopier. Get it now. Evan dashed off. Sandra remained, her arms crossed. The bright face of her watch a silent reminder that time was still money. But here, right now, time was a pulse. Oxygen. The dying cells of a heart muscle. The passing seconds had a sound. Cheryl lowered her voice, just enough for Richard to hear. You're going to be okay if we do this right. Look at me. I'm here. She gently pressed on his left shoulder, adjusting his posture to open his airway. Her hand was warm, steady. When everything else had been stripped from her colleagues, honor, long night shifts, the only thing left was skill. And that skill, here, no one else had. The AED was brought in just as the office's glass curtain wall reflected the flashing red and blue lights from a distance, the siren cutting through the city's rhythm. Evan opened the box, fumbling with the electrodes. Cheryl held out her hand. I'll do it. Without waiting for a response, she opened Richard's shirt, placed the first pad across his sternum, the second under his left armpit, her eyes briefly scanning the screen. Do not touch the patient. Analyzing rhythm, the machine said, its voice emotionless, but each word seemed to shatter the room's whispers. The moment between analyzing and shock advised was a lifetime long when standing next to someone who might die. Cheryl saw again the white lights of an ER, the silver hair of the chief of medicine who once said, "You did good." The letter of temporary suspension in an italicized font, the way her former teammates avoided her eyes in the hallway so they wouldn't have to say anything. No shock advised. Continue monitoring, the machine reported. You listen to me, she said, the counting rhythm returning, simple, steady, like a drumbeat leading troops out of a swamp. 1, 2, 3. Breathe in. 4, 5, 6. Breathe out. The door burst open again. 2 paramedics appeared, with straps, medical bags, and a folded stretcher. The female paramedic, her hair in a neat bun, took one look and understood who was in charge. You did everything right, she said quickly to Cheryl, while her other hand placed a blood pressure cuff on Richard. 182 over 110. The pressure was like water rising over a levee. Medical history? The male paramedic asked. Cheryl answered clearly, as if she had been preparing for days. Male, 56, high-stress job, frequent shortness of breath after meetings, recurrent chest pain, cold sweats, Slight tremor in the right hand, occasional nausea, denies medical checkups. Possible ACS. No information on recent medications. No known allergies. Wife not present. The female paramedic nodded, her hands moving as quickly as a pre-calculated chess game. Chewable aspirin, oxygen, cannula, monitor. Richard looked at Cheryl for the first time, as if seeing a person, not a shadow, not a blue uniform, not service staff. He saw the brown eyes that kept him from slipping into a place with no return. "Don't leave," he said hoarsely. Amidst the beeping machines, his words sounded like an unfinished apology. Cheryl stood by, not moving. She wasn't a doctor on call. Her name wasn't on any assignment board. She just had two hands that remembered the path of a struggling heart. It was enough. The gurney left the elevator, its reflection gliding across the transparent glass of the lobby. Suits paused, watched, and then quickly turned away, as if the flashing lights were an unwelcome reminder of fragility during latte hour. Cheryl stood in the lobby for a short while, the smell of ozone from the electrodes still on her hands. Evan approached, his voice softer. "Thank you, miss." From behind, whispers. "I thought she just cleaned floors." "Wow, she talks like a doctor. Probably just luck." Cheryl didn't turn around. The wind from the automatic doors blew in, making her uniform flutter. In those whispers, she heard the familiarity of other hallways. Hospital hallways. Administrative building hallways. Where people learn to turn real people into background noise. The day she was suspended, no one said, "I believe you." Some avoided her eyes. Others pressed their lips together. Everyone was busy. Being busy was the polite way to pull your foot out of the mud without getting your shoes dirty. Her phone rang. An unknown number. Cheryl looked at the screen, hesitated for a beat, and answered. "Are you the person who was just with Mr. Hale?" A middle-aged woman's voice, calm, with the depth of someone used to saying difficult things. "This is Margaret, his wife." Cheryl tightened her grip on the strap of her utility bag. "Yes, I'm on my way to the hospital. Thank you for being there." The words, "thank you," traveled through a long silence before reaching Cheryl, because on the other end, there was the sound of a carefully controlled breath. The woman was trying to stand tall in a shaking room. "I just did what needed to be done," Cheryl replied. She didn't say that she had tried to say what needed to be said days before. She didn't talk about the closed doors. In this moment, everything was small, before the heartbeat being tracked by a machine in a room 3 kilometers away. "Could you come to the hospital?" Margaret asked after a pause. "I think he'll need to see you, and I need you to tell me the things he wouldn't let anyone else say." Cheryl looked at her worn-out shoes, at her hands still marked with the faint pattern of latex. "I'll be there." She hung up, looked up, and met the mix of awe and suspicion in the eyes of a few people in the lobby. Someone raised their phone as if to record. Another said very quietly, "She was just lucky to be there at the right time." Cheryl smiled faintly. A smile not for anyone. Some skills aren't luck. Some decisions happen in a 6-second count, but behind them are 6,000 hours of standing by someone holding another's hand for the last time. She picked up her bag and walked out the door. If you've ever felt overlooked despite knowing you were painfully right, perhaps you'll understand the way Cheryl's shoulders relaxed as she stepped into the cool, mechanical wind. Stories like this, when told, often open a small window for those who've had to swallow their own dismissed warnings. If you're thinking, "I've been there," feel free to leave a comment below the video. Who knows? Your words might be the lifeline someone else grabs at the right moment. And if you find that stories like this touch something you haven't named in a long time, you can follow the channel. When you need it, it will find you, not to be loud, but just to remind you that you're not alone. The wind outside carried the fresh smell of rain. Not a downpour, but a premonitory mist, a change that was quiet, unannounced. Cheryl's footsteps were brisk as she crossed the street. With each step, she noticed the details. A small crack in the curb, the foam left on a discarded coffee cup lid, the faintly engraved word, "breathe," on a steel railing. Someone had once needed it here. As a reminder, the hospital greeted her with a familiar antiseptic smell, so familiar her heart seemed to relax by reflex. At the reception desk, she gave Richard's name, said Margaret had called. The receptionist looked up, saw the blue uniform, the service company ID. The girl's eyes hesitated, then she made a call. A minute later, a nurse with a pixie cut appeared. Her "follow me" delivered at the speed of someone who knew the length of this hallway by heart. The cardiac wing was a long, straight corridor, the recessed ceiling lights like a string of white stars. The doors had small rectangular windows, behind which lay a world of beeps and graphs. Cheryl walked past, each room holding a memory. In the third room on the left, an old man had once held her hand and called her by his wife's name, who had been gone for 10 years. She hadn't corrected him. In the seventh room, she had stood as a shield against a sudden burst of anger from a patient in pain who didn't know where else to direct it. She had stood tall. Sometimes, saving someone is about standing still. Margaret appeared at the end of the hallway, smaller than Cheryl had imagined from the press photos. She wore a beige coat, her hair tied back neatly, her deep black eyes shadowed with a faint lack of sleep, a shadow that said the past night had been weeks long. "Cheryl?" She approached, not shaking hands right away, but looking closely, as if wanting to memorize the features of the woman who had been there when she wasn't. "He's stable," Margaret said, her voice softer. "The doctors suspect it was an acute coronary syndrome. They're running more tests. Thank you for not walking away when everyone else looked past him." Cheryl nodded. Margaret led her to a long bench by a window, where the daylight pooled like a glass of water left on a table. "What did you see before today?" Margaret asked, direct and sincere. "I need the full picture," Cheryl told her. She didn't use words that would frighten, nor did she soften the hard edges. She talked about the shortness of breath after meetings, the trembling hand when signing documents, the cold sweat in an air-conditioned room, the times he gripped the edge of the desk as if the ground were slipping away. She said she had tried to speak up. She even mentioned the "amateur nurse" comment as a piece of data. Margaret listened without blinking, only her hand loosely holding a paper coffee cup. She didn't make excuses. She nodded once, very slowly. "He hates feeling out of control," she said, as if confessing. "And sometimes, the thing he controls the least is the truth." The door to the patient room opened slightly. A doctor stepped out, his name tag, Chen, glinting under the light. He glanced at Cheryl for a second as if to ask, "Who's this?" Then looked at Margaret. She gestured. "She's the one who provided first aid and monitored him before the ambulance arrived. You can speak in front of both of us." Dr. Chen spoke about cardiac enzymes, about the EKG, about the intervention plan if needed. His voice was like a road with clear signs. When he turned to leave, Cheryl exhaled as if setting down a heavy package. "You know, they wouldn't have believed me if I told them these things," Margaret said with a sad smile. "But they believe you. You have a way of speaking that doesn't put people on the defensive." She paused, her eyes looking through the small window. Richard lay there, with wires, machines, a soft green light tracing a line above his head. "Maybe it's because you don't need power to be right." Cheryl was about to say, "I was just doing my job," but the words felt empty. Her job had never been just about sweeping and mopping. Her job was not to look away when she saw a heart out of rhythm. In that silence, a burst of laughter came from the nurse's station. Thin, tense laughter. The kind people let out after a 12-hour shift. A young nurse walked by, glanced at Cheryl's name tag, and gave a small smile, the way professionals recognize each other, even out of uniform. On the waiting room table was a business magazine with Richard's face on the cover, in a dark blue suit, the headline about record quarterly revenue. Cheryl looked at the picture, then at the small window. The two Richards were like two worlds that didn't touch. One dominated charts, the other placed his entire life in the hands of those who were there at the right time and were willing to listen. There were words not spoken today but would be, not with a microphone, but with small changes like a scheduled checkup, like looking the speaker in the eye in a meeting even if they wore a service tag, like asking, "Are you okay?" and meaning it. Small things, when lined up, pull a person back from the edge. If you are in a place where your warnings are often treated as background noise, perhaps this story will touch a spot you thought had long since calloused over. Maybe you'll want to say something not necessarily for us, but for those who will read the comments and recognize themselves there. If you feel inspired, feel free to leave a short line sometimes. Just a simple, "I've been there," is enough to warm a long hallway. And if you find that stories like this help you keep faith in the quiet and right things, you can choose to follow the channel. We'll keep telling them, not loudly, but steadily like that 6-second count, so that when you need it, you know where a light is still on. Inside the room, Richard stirred slightly. The monitor's beep changed rhythm, very faintly. No one outside of this place would hear it, but to Cheryl, it was the music of a new morning. She stood up, said nothing, just adjusted the strap of her bag, and looked through the window for one more second, to commit this moment to memory. Not to hold on to a victory, but to remember that, sometimes, the only thing standing between a person and the darkness is the gaze of another saying, "I see you." She stood, her steps light as if not to disturb the air, but each one as firm as if she were laying down her own bricks on the ground. By the window, the sky had shifted to the slanted light of midday, a light that cast a thin, moist film over everything in the hospital, both warm and distant. The soft rustle of a curtain being drawn somewhere brought back a memory, so clear Cheryl could almost touch it. The smell of rubbing alcohol, of over-laundered bedsheets, the squeak of a gurney's wheels over a rubber floor tracked the 12th night shift in a month that she had signed up for, not for the money, but because other names were absent. That night, she had stood beside a very young man, his left shoulder damp with sweat from carrying a woman in his arms, who was in severe chest pain, in a taxi. "I don't have papers." "I don't," the woman had said between gasps, her sentence ending not in silence, but in another wave of pain that made her body contract. Cheryl asked nothing but what was necessary. She placed her hand on the woman's, taught her how to breathe as she had hundreds of times. She communicated quickly with the doctor, without intimidation, without judgment. When the pain subsided, the woman opened her eyes, choking out a "thank you," like a grain of salt dissolving in water. Nights like that had stacked up, and she never thought there would come a day she would walk a similar hallway as a cleaner. In her mind, there was another night. That night, she stood before a conference room door because someone had called her in. The warm yellow light of the boardroom was very different from the cold white light of the ER. There, they asked her questions that had nothing to do with patients. "Are you sure you weren't influenced by personal feelings? How do you know the patient wasn't exaggerating? Can you control your tone when responding to male colleagues?" She held a stack of papers, data, charts, cardiac enzyme curves, placed it on the table, and felt it was as light as if it had no weight. When she walked out, she knew that not all truths could save people. Sometimes, people only want to save a clean version of themselves. The sound of Margaret's shoes brought her back to the present. "He wants to see you," she said, her eyes not leaving the small window on the door. But the doctor just finished his rounds. It might be a few minutes. She turned back, her gaze gentle, but not weak, like a fine fabric that holds its shape after many washes. I wanted to ask, not about medicine, about you. Why were you there this morning? Cheryl thought for a second. There, two simple words. To answer, she had to walk down a long corridor of times she wasn't allowed to be there. Because I heard the pen drop, she said, her voice softening slightly, as if afraid of touching something fragile. The sound of it falling was different. It wasn't a thud, but a slide. The sound of a hand that could no longer hold on. She smiled faintly, almost self-mockingly. People who have spent many hours in an ER learn to listen in different ways. Margaret's lips moved as if to say more, but the door opened. Dr. Chen gave a small signal, a kind smile as if granting permission for a visitor. Just 5 minutes, he said. No stressful conversations. The hospital room was as still as a whisper held after a rainstorm. Richard was there, the wires connected to him like a clean, cold line drawing. His eyes met Cheryl's, not with confusion or hardness, but like someone who has just learned a difficult word and is trying it out. You, he paused, looked at Margaret, then back. I am sorry. Those two words, if spoken in an office, might just be a formality. Here, between the smell of alcohol and the beeping sounds, they had the weight of a measurable object. If placed on a table, you could feel the coolness of metal. Cheryl nodded, not making him try. You need to rest, she said. The rest is their job. She glanced at the monitor, saw the rhythm was a bit more regular. When the heart hurts, the body teaches you to lower your voice. Richard let out a laugh, just a puff of air, like wind against a glass pane. You are a nurse? The question was a reflex, even though he had been sure of it from the moment she placed her fingers on his wrist. I was. Cheryl held his gaze long enough for the answer not to dissolve into the air. Then I had to stop. Margaret touched her husband's hand, as if weaving another thread of the story into his last words. We can talk about it later, she whispered. But Richard shook his head, his eyes still on Cheryl. What did they do to you? This question wasn't to satisfy curiosity. It was the question of a man who was about to have to learn to ask different questions than before. Cheryl didn't name names, didn't narrate the drama of who played which role. She spoke of long days, of opening patient files late at night because she was worried about a number, of a report she knew was right but was called emotional confusion, of meetings where her calmness was mistaken for coldness, and her decisiveness was labeled aggressive. She recounted it all in an even tone, as if reading a chart. Richard was silent, not because he was tired. Some silences are maps. The deeper you go, the more paths you see. Margaret held his hand tighter, and Cheryl saw between them a patch of murky water slowly clearing. There was no conclusion. None was needed. As she walked out, she placed her hand on the cold metal of the door for a beat, like touching a milestone that she could later return to and say, here. The hallway outside was still long, but her steps spoke different sentences. Evan stood leaning against the wall, his shirt tucked in but wrinkled, a sign of a day whose schedule had been torn to shreds. He looked up, flustered. The hospital. They said he's past the worst of it. His voice cracked. I didn't believe you. His face flushed, like someone who had been running. Then he rushed his words. And it was worse. I told security, if they saw you wandering around on that floor again, to give you a warning. You were doing your job, Cheryl said, not as forgiveness, but as putting it in its place. Now, do the rest of it. Inform those who need to know, and prepare to listen. Evan nodded, as if learning a new language. He was about to leave, then turned back, his hand fumbling in his pocket. If you come back tomorrow, I'd like someone to be there when he's, you know, scared. He bit his lip. The word scared, struggling to pass the throat of a man used to using words like delay, risk, strategy. Cheryl just nodded. In the hospital parking garage, a fine mist like rain was falling. Across the street, a young woman held a small child, sheltering them with a thin coat as she hurried along. Small things like that bend time. Cheryl saw herself years ago, just off a long night shift, shoulder aching, holding a bag and a bouquet of flowers someone had given her in the hallway because she had saved my husband, waiting for the bus at 5 a.m., with a few others whose eyes were also red from lack of sleep. Back then, she couldn't have imagined a dawn where she would be holding a mop instead of a stethoscope. But dawn still came, and she still went to work, still carried her skills with her like she carried her breath. Her phone vibrated. A text. Initial results are good. Thank you for telling your story. It was Margaret's number. Cheryl read it, put her phone away, and gripped her bag tighter. She didn't feel light. She felt heavy, as a living thing. Not a burden. The weight of what is right. The next day, the 40th floor greeted her with a different atmosphere like the same painting, but the colors had shifted a very slight tone. The old security guard smiled and nodded. At the reception desk, the young woman who usually glanced past her as if she weren't there said, "Good morning," clearly enough that it couldn't be a mistake. In the elevator, people held their breath, unsure how to act like standing before a statue that had moved in the night, finding the corner of the room different in the morning without any explanation. Cheryl went into the women's restroom, turned on the faucet, and held her hands under the cold stream until her skin was numb. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a face whose main lines had never changed, only adding fine traces like a time-written code. She dried her hands with a paper towel, folding it neatly as was her habit at the hospital. Everything had to be in its place before the next shift arrived. Evan was waiting in the hallway, holding a white visitor's pass. "So you won't be stopped," he said, placing it in Cheryl's hand. His lips pressed together as if he were placing a stone instead of a piece of plastic. Margaret, she also texted, "If you need any documents." "I don't," Cheryl replied, putting the pass in her pocket. Her voice soft, but enough to stop a sentence that might go too far. "I'm here to do my job." The boardroom door was ajar. Sandra stood inside, hesitating like someone sounding out a difficult word. Her eyeliner was still sharp, but today her eyes were watery, as if from a sleepless night. "I wanted to say thank you." Each word was like stepping on thin ice. "Yesterday, I was too." She swallowed, searching for the word. Rigid. Cheryl was silent. Sometimes, stillness is the rope others grab onto to pull themselves to shore. Sandra took a breath. "We have a meeting tomorrow about internal health policies. If you could share some insights for the staff, things that, here, we haven't seen." A small scratch in the old painting. Through it, light seeped in. At noon, her phone rang again. The hospital. Richard was awake. Wanted to practice breathing exercises with guidance. Cheryl turned her car around. The smell of antiseptic greeted her again. In the room, Richard was sitting up more, with extra pillows. There was an invisible line running from the light in his eyes to the door, a fear he had learned to name. "Teach me to count again," he said, his voice just loud enough, as if asking permission for a lesson he had once dismissed. Cheryl sat down, not too close, not too far, and began to count numbers not to fill the silence, but to guide someone through it. As evening approached, the sky turned a leaden gray. Margaret's text arrived like a touch of warmth. "Thank you," he said. "Counting with you makes him feel less alone." Cheryl put her phone down and looked out the window. The parking lot reflected the clouds. A young woman sat on a curb, holding her phone, crying silently, and a male nurse walked by, handing her a box of tissues without asking. Small scenes like that usually fly by. Today, Cheryl let it linger in her eyes, like a small stone holding down a piece of paper so the wind wouldn't blow it away. In the following days, the change spread like water seeping into cotton. Not loud, no fanfare, but someone called the clinic to schedule their first checkup in 4 years. Someone printed a early warning signs poster and put it up in the elevator. Someone asked Cheryl how to handle seeing a colleague gasping for breath after taking the stairs. A new water pitcher appeared in the conference room with a fruit platter, instead of just black coffee and mints. Small but persistent things, like fine embroidery threads, creating a fabric that could embrace. And then, on a gray afternoon, as Cheryl was wiping the edge of a glass table, Evan's phone flashed with an urgent call. His room. His heart rate dropped. He spoke quickly, his voice breaking. Cheryl's body reacted before her mind. She dropped the cloth and ran. The hallway seemed to stretch. Everything in front of her blurred with speed, but her ears heard every rhythm clearly. The squeak of a cart's wheels, the sound of a door bursting open, the short, sharp commands. The room was wide open. Richard was pale, cold sweat on his temples, his hands clenched, his lips dry and cracked. The monitor beeped frantically like a panicked bird in a cage. Vasovagal? Drug-induced hypotension? Or Dr. Chen said quickly. A nurse handed him an IV line. Another checked the airway. Cheryl stood where she wouldn't be in the way, her eyes scanning. The pillow had slipped. His position was no longer optimal. The oxygen tube was slightly askew. "Mr. Hale, look at me," she said. Her voice not loud, but as concise as a tightly tied rope. "Count." She didn't need to look at anyone for permission. Amidst the precise scientific chaos, there was something only those who had spent too long in this kind of room knew. How to pull someone back from the edge of fear with just the tone of your voice. Margaret stood in the corner, her hands gripping her sleeves until her knuckles were white. She didn't speak, just watched, and in her eyes was a trust she was relearning, like a child learning to read. Sounding out each letter, then forming words, then reading fluently without fear of making a mistake. Richard breathed along short, broken, then longer. The monitor's rhythm slowed. Someone's shoulders relaxed. Dr. Chen adjusted the medication. A nurse took notes. A hand remained on his chest to feel the rise and fall. Cheryl counted 2 more beats, then went silent, letting the room hear its own quiet. When the crisis passed, everyone exhaled at once, a small wave rolling through the room. Margaret brought a hand to her mouth, not to stifle a sob, but to cover the confusion of someone who had just witnessed a miracle and was trying to call it by its scientific name. Doctor. Chen glanced at Cheryl and gave a very slight nod, the kind only professionals understand, like bestowing a medal without a ribbon. Later, when the room was quiet, Margaret pulled Cheryl into the hallway. "You know, when you were counting," he came back, instead of following the fear somewhere else. She spoke slowly, letting each word have time to land. "I thought only doctors could do these things." She smiled, tired. "It turns out, some things are simple, but no one believes them if the person saying them isn't wearing a white coat." Cheryl leaned her back lightly against the wall, the coolness seeping through her uniform. "I used to wear one," she said, not with complaint or regret, but as if talking about an old coat hanging in a closet that she occasionally opens to smell the rain. "Then they told me to be quiet." "Not anymore," Margaret replied, her voice like a promise she was making more to herself. "Now, I won't let anyone tell you to be quiet." At the end of the hallway, Evan was hovering. He held up a stack of papers, a breathing exercise schedule, a diet plan, a list of questions for the doctor, and another sheet with the bolded title, Proposed Executive Health Screening Program. At the bottom was the line, drafted by E.L., with consultation from S.W. Evan, looked embarrassed. I used initials, because, you know. Cheryl didn't smile. She just nodded, a warmth in her eyes. Sometimes, a set of initials is the safest way for change to pass through closed doors without being stopped by a name. In the evening, the sky suddenly cleared, like someone who has just finished crying. From the hospital room window, you could see a thin line where the sky met the rooftops. Richard was sleeping, breathing evenly, a bit of color back in his lips. Margaret was asleep in a chair, one hand still resting on the edge of the bed, like a thread connecting them. Cheryl stood and watched. Not for long, just enough to save a scene that she could later open when she needed to believe that small things, accumulated, can create something real. She took out her phone, opened the Notes app, and wrote one line, "Counting equals a bridge," then put it away. As she walked out into the hallway, she heard someone call her name softly. The nurse, with the pixie cut from that morning. Could you, tonight, if you're free, stop by the training room for a quick session with the new staff on recognizing early warning signs? Just 15 minutes. A lot of the new ones, they've never worked an ER shift, so they can miss some of the subtle things. She said it like she was tossing a pebble into the water, small, but with wide ripples. Cheryl nodded, and as she followed the young woman around a corner, she felt a light breeze on the back of her neck. Not from the air conditioning. It was the kind of breeze you feel when a door that has always automatically closed is held open by someone with a small wedge, so others can pass through without getting their hands caught. In the training hallway, a few young faces looked up, a little confused to see someone in a blue uniform step to the front of the class. Cheryl stood before them, not introducing herself with a, "My name is." She placed the AED on the table, opened the lid, and said, "A person may not need to know the terminology, but they will remember a rhythm. We'll start there." And she began, her voice calm, her hands demonstrating, her eyes looking at each face to make sure no one was lost. When Cheryl left the hospital, the night had softened into a gentle dark. The wet road reflected the streetlights like ribbons stretching to infinity. She walked more slowly than when she had arrived, not because she was tired, but because she wanted to listen a little longer to the sound of the city exhaling. On a street corner, a small shop was still open. Inside, the owner was pouring tea for an old man, the steam rising like a private cloud for just the two of them. Across the street, a group of night shift workers were laughing as they shared a paper-wrapped sandwich. These brief scenes arranged themselves into a handwritten copy of Patience. And the next day, and the day after, the small circles widened, not dramatically, but with persistence. At the company, the initial fearful glances turned into welcoming gazes. The "Leave the mop over there" was replaced with, "Do you need anything else? We can help." The bulletin board had a new section, "Sharing experiences when you've seen what others didn't." Someone from accounting wrote, "I once warned about a small discrepancy and was told it was trivial. The next month, it became a major problem. Turns out, you don't always have to be loud. You just have to be right on time." Someone from HR shared their own story of a panic attack in an elevator and the shame of being a manager and shaking like that, a story that got many likes, not out of pity, but out of self-recognition. Names began to emerge from their hiding places. Cheryl moved through these changes like someone walking through a garden after a rain, her hands not plucking leaves, her eyes not seeking flowers. She just noticed the earth smelled richer, and the insects sounded louder than usual. At the hospital, Richard practiced breathing, walking, and accepting the word "can't" as a staircase to go down to the street, not as a wall. He spoke less. Each sentence had weight. Once, he looked at Cheryl for a long time and said, "I built conference rooms where your voice wasn't heard. I'm going to change how I build." Not a promise, but a technical decision, like repositioning a load-bearing beam. That day, it wasn't raining. The wind was dry, the sky clear, the clouds like shattered glass. Cheryl walked toward the bus station, past a small park where kids were playing on a slide, their laughter shooting up like low fireworks. An elderly woman sat on a bench, her shoulders relaxed, eyes closed, her face turned toward the sun. Cheryl slowed down, feeling as if she could hear someone counting somewhere. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. A new rhythm that had become the rhythm of the city's life. She smiled, not with satisfaction or victory, but with the knowledge that tomorrow, when she walked into that office with its white light, she would still see something very small that others didn't, and she would open her mouth again without changing her voice, without needing anyone to nod first, because what is right has its own sound, beat by beat, breath by breath, not loud but persistent, not fast but sure. Just like that, it walks with you. She smiled, not out of satisfaction or victory, but because she knew that tomorrow, when she walked into that office with its white light, she would still see something very small that others didn't, and she would open her mouth again, without changing her voice, without needing anyone to nod first, because what is right has its own sound, beat by beat, breath by breath, not loud but persistent, not fast but sure. Just like that, it walks with you. The next morning, the 40th floor was no longer the same 40th floor from the week before. There was something softer in the way the suits walked past Cheryl's blue uniform. A few of the averted gazes now knew how to linger for more than a second. Enough to utter a quiet hello, lost in the sounds of printers and coffee. Evan had placed an extra chair in the corner of the waiting area, in case anyone needs a rest. A small detail, but Cheryl knew it didn't appear on its own. Richard was still in the hospital, but the office had begun to reflect his absence. On the large conference table, instead of a thick stack of files, were a few thin sheets of paper with the title, "New Health Policy, Draft." And at the end, her name appeared under the Unofficial Advisor section. The font was small, but it was there. Cheryl said nothing when she saw her name, just placed her mop in the corner, her hand gently gliding over the glass table, as if checking to see if it was clean enough to reflect something new. In the afternoon, her phone rang. An unknown number appeared, with a familiar area code, the old neighborhood, where everything had begun and ended too quickly. "Cheryl Washington?" A man's voice, dry and hard. "Yes, this is she. This is Barnes. We used to work together." Oh, the name was like an old scar on her skin, healed but still capable of a dull ache if touched in just the right spot. Mitchell Barnes, the doctor who had helped push her out of the profession, the one who had smiled coldly and said, "Maybe this place isn't for you," on the day she lost everything. "What can I do for you?" Cheryl asked, keeping her voice even, not letting the past pull her breath off rhythm. "I hear you're working at Brooks Pharmaceutical." "I am." He paused for a second, then lowered his voice. "I have a patient who needs someone with clinical observation experience, but I can't officially put your name down. I just need help for a few days." Cheryl looked up, seeing her reflection in the office window. The man on the other end of the line still thought she would accept just to be able to practice again, even if it meant accepting an invisible role once more. "No, thank you." The answer was clean, as solid as a stone dropped in water. The other end was silent. "You'll find someone suitable, doctor," Cheryl added, then hung up before he could find the words to justify himself. That evening, Margaret called. "He wants to see you." Not to apologize. He's already done that, but to discuss something. Cheryl went to the hospital, carrying a small paper bag, a few ripe oranges, an old habit from her nursing years, knowing that vitamin C and a natural fragrance could make a hospital room smell less like medicine. Richard was sitting in a chair by the window, no longer hooked up to machines, but still wearing a monitoring bracelet. He handed her a thin file. "I want to start a foundation, in your name, for people who have been pushed out of their profession because of politics, prejudice, injustice. They will have a place to come back to." Cheryl opened the file, skimming the dry legal text. The paperwork was just paperwork, but she could hear the true intention in the way he placed it in her hands. Not pushing, not forcing, but as if handing over a piece of responsibility. "Are you sure you want my name on it?" she asked, half sincere, half testing. "I've learned that the right name needs to be in the right place. This time, I want to start from there." In the following days, Cheryl continued her cleaning duties while quietly helping the HR department organize a recognizing crisis signs session for all employees. She didn't wear a white coat, didn't stand on a high podium. She just held an AED, a glass of water, and told a few short stories about the sound of a falling pen, about a change in breath after an argument, about the slight tremor at the corner of a mouth when a heart starts to cry for help. Everyone listened in silence, not because they were told to, but because they realized they were learning something that could save a life, maybe even their own. One late evening, when everyone had gone home, Cheryl stood alone in the glass-walled office, looking down at the city glittering with lights. A gentle breeze blew through a crack in the window, carrying the damp, smoky smell of the previous night's rain. She thought about the path she had taken from sleepless night shifts to cold, turned backs in hallways, to the moment she saved a life without needing anyone's permission. Now, whenever she walked onto the 40th floor, she was no longer seen as the blue shadow. But what made her smile wasn't the recognition. It was knowing that if, tomorrow, a pen fell to the floor with that familiar sound, she would still be able to step forward, to offer her hand, to count each breath for someone no matter who they were, and no matter how they had once seen her. That night, Brooks Pharmaceutical held a special meeting in the large auditorium on the ground floor. On the surface, it was an update on HR strategy and internal health following the CEO's hospitalization. But Cheryl knew there was another reason. Richard had requested that the entire leadership team and all department heads be present, along with some special guests. Cheryl had been invited by Margaret. "You don't need to prepare anything," she had said. "Just come. And if he asks, just say what is true." When Cheryl walked in, warm yellow light spread over the rows of chairs. Familiar faces, some looking straight ahead, some turning away, were all directed toward the stage, where Richard sat in the middle chair, with Margaret and Dr. Chen beside him. His familiar dark blue suit had been replaced with a white, open-collared shirt, no tie. He no longer looked like the cold icon on a magazine cover, but like a person who had just survived a shock and bore its marks. The low murmur of conversation quieted as Richard began to speak. "Over the past few weeks, I have learned something that, for the past 30 years, I thought I already knew. The life of a company doesn't just lie with the people who sign contracts or present to the board. It also lies with the people we see the least, but who, when needed, see everything." He paused, his eyes scanning the auditorium, then settling on Cheryl. "I want to introduce you all to the person who saved my life." More than once, a spotlight moved to where Cheryl was sitting. The row of chairs opened a path. She stood up and walked slowly but firmly, the sound of her heels just loud enough to be heard. The feeling of all eyes on her made her heart beat faster, but not with fear. This wasn't the first time she had stood before a crowd. It was just the first time in years she was standing here not to defend herself, but to speak. Richard offered her the microphone. "She can say whatever she wants, and this time, I'll be the one to listen first." Cheryl looked around, seeing Sandra in a row to her right, Evan near the back, and a few other faces that had once treated her as part of the background. She took a breath, the small sound echoing in her own chest. "I'm not here to retell the story of saving a life," Cheryl began, her voice clear but not loud. "That happened. And it wasn't a miracle. It was skill. What I want to talk about is what happened before that." She spoke briefly, without embellishment, without exaggeration. The time she had noticed the signs, the time she was brushed aside, the cold looks, the closed doors. She didn't name anyone, but every detail made the air in the room thick because everyone here knew they had contributed a piece of silence to it. "I used to be a cardiac nurse, and I lost everything for daring to speak up about an injustice," Cheryl continued, her eyes pausing on a few faces. "When I was pushed out of my profession, I thought I would never have the chance to save a life again. But I was wrong. The opportunity doesn't disappear. It just changes form, and what matters is whether you are brave enough to seize it when it appears, even if the person who needs you is someone who has never respected you." In the auditorium, deep breaths were taken from many sides. Evan bowed his head. Sandra clenched her hands in her lap. Margaret sat straight, her eyes bright, as if engraving every word into her memory. Cheryl concluded, not with a grand call to action, but with a gentle sentence. "If today, someone in this company sees something wrong, whether it's with someone's health, with the numbers, or with a person, and you choose to speak up, you have already saved someone, even if they don't realize it yet." She put the microphone down. No one clapped right away. The silence lasted for a few seconds. Then a round of applause began, not loud, not in unison, but spreading like a wave. Richard was the first to stand, then Margaret, then the whole auditorium. After the event, Richard approved the Cheryl Washington Foundation, the corporation's first fund to support healthcare professionals who had been unjustly pushed out of their careers. Sandra personally offered a direct apology. Evan invited Cheryl to join the internal training group as a guest lecturer. And Cheryl still wore her blue uniform, still pushed her utility card every morning. But now, whenever she walked down the hallway, there were nods. There were, "Good morning, miss." Cheryl's not to curry favor, but out of genuine gratitude. She had never needed a title to save a life. But this time, she had something more. A room full of people, ready to listen. That morning, the Brooks Pharmaceutical Building was, as it always was, a grand lobby with pristine white light, the gentle whir of the coffee machine from the pantry, a few groups of employees laughing softly as they exchanged documents. Cheryl pushed her cleaning cart along the 30th floor hallway. She still started with the CEO's office now. The door was always open. Richard sat inside, no longer wearing his shiny silver watch, just a hot cup of tea at his side and an open file. When he saw her pass, he looked up and smiled faintly, a nod that was enough to say "I remember" without words. She continued her work, wiping the tables, arranging the chairs, picking up a newspaper that had fallen on the floor. The front-page story was about a young doctor in another state who had saved a patient by recognizing the early signs of heart disease, and in a quote, he mentioned the story of a nurse who once worked as a cleaner as his inspiration. Cheryl placed the newspaper on the pantry table and smiled to herself. She didn't need to know who that doctor was. She just knew that, somewhere, someone had seen, had listened, and had acted. Outside the glass window, the city moved at its frantic pace. But inside, Cheryl felt a clear certainty. The world would never be perfectly fair, but every moment you choose to do the right thing regardless of how others see you is what truly changes it. She gently gripped the handle of her utility cart and continued down the hallway, leaving behind her calm footsteps and a clean, bright space, just like the mark she was leaving on this world. Quiet, but impossible to erase.